Okay, sehr geehrter Herr Müller, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, my name is Stéphane Dion, I am the Canadian ambassador in Germany. Ladies and gentlemen, chers amis du Canada, welcome to this 17th edition of the International Dialogue on Education. Okay, it's completely an online edition, which is necessary under the circumstances. But still, it is an edition. There is indeed a dialogue on education, and we will take full advantage of it, despite the fact that we cannot meet physically. We will do it because the topic we have chosen is very important. It is crucial, in fact, diversity driving excellence. As Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said, diversity is a fact. Inclusion is a choice, the right choice. Diversity is a fact. Diversity of the student body in Canada, 40% of graduate students now identify as belonging to a racialized or indigenous group, 40%, more than in the general population, which is 22%. Diversity is a fact also at the level of university administration. In Canada, according to the 2019 survey report of Universities Canada, approximately 60% of senior university leaders identify as belonging to at least one of the designated equity-seeking groups: women, racialized peoples, people with disabilities, indigenous peoples, LGBTQ2S+. Racialized people represent 21% of full-time faculty, 31% of doctorate holders, and as you remember, 22% of the whole Canadian population. The proportion of women in senior leadership positions reaches 49%, almost at par then with men. However, we still need to make progress. Racialized people only represent 8% of senior leaders, and there are only few women in the executive head and vice president positions. So, yes, diversity is a fact, but inclusion is the right choice. The right choice from the point of view of justice, to ensure that each human being will be judged according to the strength of character and not according to the skin color or other collective attributes, to evoke the famous dream of Martin Luther King. Inclusion is also the right choice from the point of view of our dialogue of today, the point of view of the advancement of knowledge to drive excellence, in order to break down the barriers which prevent every human being from offering her or his full potential to society and to science. We need a diversity of ideas, talent, and experiences in order to creating a higher education and research ecosystem that responds to global challenges. This will help to build an innovative, prosperous, and inclusive dialogue. Canadian universities have recently agreed on an action plan on equity, diversity, and inclusion. Canadian universities commit, and I quote, to build institutional capacity and culture to integrate equity, diversity, and inclusion considerations in research, teaching, and learning, end of quote. With this conference that we have today, we are taking another step towards determining what policies and measures we need to create a university environment in which everyone, regardless of their gender, sexual orientation, collective identities, everyone will be able to succeed. I am very interested in hearing from our speakers how this matter plays out in their respective context. So we'll hear Mr. Kieron Broadhead, Executive Director of Student Experience, Southampton University, United Kingdom. Dr. Andrea Burman, Professor of Sociology and Vice President for Teaching and Study, Equality and Diversity, University of Göttingen, Germany. Dr. Denise O'Neill Green, Vice President for Equity and Community Inclusion and Associate Professor in the School of Child and Youth Care in the Faculty of Community Services, Ryerson University, Canada. And Dr. Jeffrey Peck, Director of Europe, AKA Strategy. Thank you very much for agreeing to participate in this discussion, all of you. As well, a big thanks to Mr. Jan-Martin Vierda, who will moderate the discussion. I am very glad for the continued support of our organizing partners from the DAAD, Freie Universität Berlin, the Fulbright Commission, and the British Council. Many thanks to everyone on the team for helping to make this event happen. And with this, allow me to pass the floor virtually to Herr Müller, Deputy Secretary General. Vielen Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit. Merci du fond du cœur. Dr. Müller.
Dear Ambassador Dion, thank you very much for your kind words of introduction. Dear partners of International Dialogue on Education Berlin, which is British Council, the German-American Fulbright Commission, the Embassy of Canada in Germany, and Freie Universität Berlin. Distinguished speakers, dear Jan-Martin Vierda, and dear guests, we all had wished to be together, to meet at the beautiful premises of the Canadian Embassy in Berlin, to talk to old friends and to meet new colleagues. However, the general conditions, as the ambassador rightly said so, the conditions do not allow this. This IDE conference will be different from all previous ones, and so I do hope very sincerely will be different from the next editions to come in the following years. The purpose of IDE, however, remains the same: to enrich the debate on science, research, and higher education policy in Germany through the participation of international experts and practitioners. The aim is to place German perspectives in a global context and to allow us to learn from successful experiences from other countries. In 2 words, exploring difference. I am pleased to open the 17th IDE conference. The topic of this year's conference is Diversity, Driving Excellence, Gaining the Competitive Edge. Open access to higher education significantly contributes to greater equality. Consequently, the DAD, the German Academic Exchange Service, aims to continually increase the participation of lesser represented social groups in its programs. Diversity and inclusion are distinctive characteristics of high-performance science systems. A diversity of personal backgrounds represents a critical resource of knowledge and experiences which enables the development of new concepts and approaches in teaching and research. If you allow, I wish to cite the recently published strategy for DAD's work in the next 5 years, the strategy document DAD 2025. And I quote, "The DAD sees the diversity as an opportunity to increase the quality of its funding activities. With greater participation, it is possible to achieve even higher social and political acceptance, integrate a multitude of talented minds from diverse contexts into German and foreign universities, and tap the potential of new impulses and academic creativity. Therefore, the DAD shall thrive strive to develop all its programs in such a way that encourages participation of lesser represented target groups, strengthens the diversity of its funding recipients, and thus adequately reflects the increasingly heterogeneous profile of the students. End of quote. Now, this refers to funding organizations like us and to scholarship programs. Now, how's the situation at the universities themselves? In Germany, the proportion of young people of a given generation with a university entrance qualification has been increasing steadily since the 2000s. And more of them are enrolling for a degree. The number of foreign students is also increasing. The campuses become more diverse. Students differ according to social background, culture, age, ethnic group, religion, or sexual orientation. And this list is not complete. But do different groups have the same opportunities? Today, diversity is accepted as a value at universities. We find it in all mission statements of higher education institutions. We may find a small number of vice presidents for diversity. So it still needs to be cultivated, to be lived as a principle for the benefit of all. Coming back to DAD and its funding programs, DAD has contributed in the last years to broaden access and increase diversity through new programs. With these, we looked at a set of groups which tend to be underrepresented in international mobility programs, like students in teacher training courses, like students at Fachhochschulen, which is universities of applied sciences. By these two specific programs, we also reached out to an important number of students which we can consider as first-generation academics, and on another dimension, to many students from families with a background of immigration to Germany. With a specific large program for the integration of refugees into universities, the DAD has also initiated and promoted the discussion on better support for disadvantaged groups at German universities. However, there is still room for improvement. This is why we are here. So I wish to thank you all for participating and bringing an international perspective into the German debate on this key issue. Our guests, the ambassador has already announced you, are Dr. Kieran Broadhead from Southampton, Dr. Andrea Bührmann from Göttingen, University of Göttingen, which actually is my first alma mater, and Dr. Denise O'Neill-Green from Ryerson University, Canada, and our good friend Jeff Peck, who lives in Berlin and is a director of AKA Strategy. The chair, again, is our moderator, Jan-Martin Viada, who is a true friend of IDE, I think I can say. So enjoy this afternoon. Feel invited to contribute to our discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christian Müller. Also, a warm welcome from my side to all of you to this, unfortunately, as we heard, very different International Dialogue on Education conference. Unfortunate is that we cannot interact in person this time. Fortunate is that we can discuss, nevertheless, and learn from each other in regard to making universities a better place for everybody. Exploring difference, diversity driving excellence, gaining the competitive edge. That's the title of our panel today. And as we know in our societies that are changing and becoming more and more diverse, many people argue the same should be the case for universities. And many universities across the world actually are changing and have taken steps to become more inclusive and to explore new ways for students from underserved and underrepresented backgrounds to participate and succeed. In Germany, the academic discourse about diversity is mostly a recent one. And so there is still a way to go and much to learn. That's what today's conference is about. So aside from the all good intentions and or aside from, and I quote the title of the conference again, gaining the competitive edge, what does real diversity at universities and in academia in general demand? What levels and areas of the university are touched and who needs to respond? We're going to take a holistic approach to diversity from student life to faculty to university leadership. A very timely and somewhat complicated debate. Therefore, it is good not to be on your own with them, with those issues. IDE conferences always are about exploring differences and about finding common ground with international experts. And since universities in the English-speaking world have been dealing with the topic much longer and more intensely than German universities, I'm happy to be joined by a number of distinguished international higher education representatives, this time from the United States, Canada, Britain, and Germany. And since they have been introduced to you already twice, I think I can skip this part and dip right into the discussion. And we are going to start with a series of short interviews so that we can learn a little bit more about the situation in each and specific country. And I would like to start with you, Denise Green. Beside being Vice President Equity and Community Inclusion at Ryerson, you're also Associate Professor in the School of Child and Youth Care and the Faculty of Community Services. You have over 30 years of experience in the post-secondary sector. And you say when it comes to fostering diversity, many universities are still working at the level of talk, discovery, whereas marginalized communities expect action, accountability. From what the ambassador just said, it seems like Canadian universities are already taking action. Or is that a little bit exaggerated and there is still a lot of talk out there, Denise? You have to switch on the sound.
Thank you for that. So thank you for having me today. And yes, there is a lot of talk. There's a great understanding that excellence, inclusive excellence is the goal. However, universities are very complex, decentralized organizations. And even though your president and senior leaders may say, and in very sincere, intentional ways, speak to diversity being a fact and inclusion being the choice that we must make, integrating it within the organization is still very challenging. And my role as Vice President, Equity and Community Inclusion is about making that actual talk a reality on the ground, not only for students, but for faculty and for staff and various community members and so forth. So the idea
of how to make an idea real, just some examples of what you actually are doing to make those aspirations real.
Yeah, thank you. The way to make those aspirations real tend to begin with being informed by data, being informed by equity data, and Canadian universities are very different in how they collect data. There's not a national system for doing so, and that's an important step that needs to happen. Different universities have taken on the challenge of collecting their own equity, diversity, and inclusion data. We do that at Ryerson, and it's done in a way to help senior leaders and faculty to use that information to drive the development of their curriculum, to drive recruitment. It was mentioned earlier about first-generation students, about increasing the presence of racialized students, and definitely in Canada, a greater emphasis on Indigenous students and Indigenous recruitment has been a part of that diversity and driving excellence agenda. Just real quickly, one other way of doing so is diversifying the faculty and recognizing that those from equity-seeking groups, that talent needs to be brought into the academic community. And so not only women, but also those from racialized communities, those from with disabilities, those from the LGBTQ community, and again, the indigenous community.
Mm-hmm. So those are some of the institutional steps that you're taking. What about the external framework, the political framework? How does that help?
The political framework, I would say, aids in really pushing our institutions to take on these challenges in a very real way. As I said earlier, universities are very complex and decentralized organizations. So the change in legislation, for example, the idea of requiring data to be collected on employees who are a part of these equity-seeking groups is one aspect of it. The Human Rights Code is also another way of making sure that our environments are free of discrimination and harassment. And then as of late, there has been the development of a uniform approach to sexual violence policies so that we can guarantee that the environment is free of sexual harassment and different types of harassment directed towards people because of their own gender and sexuality. You know, those are topics that we often don't want to talk about, but it's important to table those because it does address the type of environments that can foster within our organizations and prevent inclusive excellence from happening. Mm-hmm. So the government, actual community groups, and we all are familiar with what happened in the US this past summer, that also sparked a lot of external pressure from our various communities to push universities to recognize that racism continues to exist and that we must be very intentional in how we address it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Denise Green, for now. And I should just point out at this point that later during the discussion, you and the virtual audience can also add your questions and comments, and we will just pick them up later on during the panel. So please feel free to write your questions to some of the panelists, to all of the panelists into the chat, and we will address them later on. Thank you very much, Denise Green, for the time being. And I would like to move on to Kieran Broadhead. As I said, you are Executive Director of Student Experience at the University of Southampton. You're responsible for all the non-academic student provision in the university, including international recruitment, relations, global mobility, and student support. And you say, when it comes to attracting a diverse and high quality student cohort, and I quote, "We are regulated heavily in this space, but we also have a real ambition to attract students from the broadest range of backgrounds." So what comes first, the regulation or the true ambition, Kieran? You have to switch on the sound.
I hoped I wouldn't do that. Thank you. And thank you for having me this afternoon. I would hope that real ambition comes first in answer to your question. And indeed, that our equality, diversity and inclusion strategy is very key, that we believe that true equality and diversity and true inclusion is a major asset that will help us be a world-leading university, attracting the brightest talent, but not only those people who may be traditional into the workforce and to the student population is a vital part of what we are trying to do as a university, I would say. So I think our ambition definitely comes first.
Can you give us some concrete examples of the regulations that you were talking about?
Yeah, absolutely, not a problem at all. I mean, the UK higher education sector is heavily regulated, and mostly because as a public sector area where we're governed by public sector duties, the Equality Act 2010 really gives the bedrock for the whole country in terms of how we manage the 9 protected characteristics which are identified and what we should be doing to not discrimination on that basis. This is slightly different in the way that it's applied in the devolved administration, so slightly different in Scotland and Northern Ireland, but broadly speaking for the whole university sector, there is an expectation that we will meet that public sector duty. The way that is then governed is one of the most important ways for us to think about it. So they have created a heavy regulating body, the Office for Students, to worry about the student interest. And that is a regulator. It isn't really a partner. They give us very strict rules, and we have to pass a series of tests to be registered as universities and have a university title. And the very first of those conditions that we call them, the A condition, you can tell it's the start of the alphabet, is a condition relating to access and participation, to the duty that we have to widen participation and ensure student success for all students across the country. It's very interesting. They enshrined in law in our Higher Education Act the role of a director of fair access and participation. That director has the ability to withdraw our ability to charge tuition fees and can hold us to account in terms of our registration status. And they've also created something called the Centre for Transforming Access and Student Outcomes in Higher Education, this unit, which is essentially a What Works unit to share best practice. What it's really done for us is it's provided a framework against which all of our student recruitment and our student success actions can be measured with some very strict and hard national measures. So there are national targets, 5 of them, which dictate how far the sector has to go in terms of transforming our ability to recruit students. So there is a hope that there will be no gap in university entrance between those who are most privileged and least privileged in terms of socioeconomic background by 2034. That is a stretching ambition, and it's what drives lots of the work that we then have to do. We have to write something called an access and participation plan that has to be approved by our regulating body in order for us to operate. And if we aren't ambitious enough, they can impose conditions upon our university status for not being able to do that. That being said, as I said, that isn't something universities in the UK are struggling with. We believe it's the right thing for us to be doing. No university is fighting this regulatory framework. It should be work that we're doing in the broadest sense. And so it's something that we're expected to do.
Mm-hmm. And in order to make this system work, you need a lot of really good data, because otherwise you don't know if you meet the goals or not. So there is like something like a national description of data and how to collect data, some common definition of what means what.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the things we are privileged within the UK higher education sector, I think, to have quite a standard data collection process. So upon application, there is one centralised application system for all undergraduate provision in the UK. There is definition of what data must be collected and returned to our Higher Education Statistical Agency. There is an expectation that we will measure, for example, socioeconomic background, gender, disability status. Also, we can do things to protect those characteristics and support students. But it does give us a framework around which we can measure. There is also a national set which measures how we're doing against returns on an annual basis and compares us, for example, to our local context or to our region, identifies the gaps in performance that they would expect to see. So a good example is in the University of Southampton, 17% of our student population is from a Black, Asian or minority ethnic group. That is ahead of our Southampton local average, but below the national average. And so that derives some of the distance that the sector believes we need to travel in order to be able to feel like we are representative of the communities that we are resident within.
So it's a very transparent, but at the same time also very competitive system. Thank you very much, Kieran, for the time being. And I would like to move on to Jeffrey Peck. After your tenure as Dean and Vice Provost at Baruch College and at the City University of New York, you moved to Berlin. Also because you had the goal, Jeff, to bring a little bit more of diversity, at least debate to German universities, maybe even to change the approach of the attitude of some people at the German universities. Have you been successful so far, Jeff?
Well, first of all, thank you for including me in this. would have to say, no, I've not been successful. And I think it was a grand expectation of mine to imagine that I could make any significant change. But what I really wanted to do, and perhaps I have helped in changing some of the terms of the debate and bringing American perspectives on diversity to bear in questions that need to be asked. I think it's, as has been pointed out, it's very complex and I have to say often uncomfortable to try to make these policies or the discourse around diversity into reality. But I think that there is in Germany a great deal of discussion about it, but as you mentioned yourself, Jan Martin, there's a long way to go. And I think there are differences. And I think in any kind of discussion like this, it's important to remember, and it has to do with language, the fact that one uses in Germany diversity, an American, North American English word for this, and often things that one can bring ways of going about dealing with diversity from the American or North American context to bear here. And it's really not the same at all. And I think that the structures, the governance, the financing, the role of faculty, the students are so different in Germany from what we know in North America. And I've also learned from the UK that it's going to take a long time to make the kind of progress I think that universities would like to, but it may be very different. And I think that's something that working with the Fulbright Commission on a diversity report, we learned that diversity can be defined in very different ways. And it's important to see that diversity in other countries may not be the same as it is in North America. So context is very, very important.
So let's get started by talking about the understanding of diversity at CUNY, the understanding of diversity that you were working on for many years while you were dean and professor at CUNY. What was diversity? What did diversity mean to you at CUNY?
I think one of the things, I think at CUNY, it's very much like it is in most major North American universities, but there's something that have to do with gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the thing that I learned in the work that I did at CUNY, especially with people who were in charge of enrollment management as well as diversity and inclusion, is that, and this has been pointed out, I think already, that just having people who are different is not enough. It's not just about celebrating the difference, as often said, it's about instituting in a purposeful and strategic way a process that changes the system from top to bottom and across the board. Everyone has to be involved in making diversity work. There have to be special programs that are created. There are many of those that were created at the City University of New York. And there have to be curricular developments that have to focus on bringing people together from different backgrounds. It has to be intentional and it has to be explicit. And it has to include all the stakeholders. So it's not enough to have someone from the top make claims that this is what has to happen, but there has to be a commitment by all stakeholders in the institution and if it's going to succeed. So what I think I learned at CUNY was that diversity is much more than just gathering different kinds of people together.
So, but how can you develop such kind of dedication, such kind of common ground that everybody thinks, or most people think that, well, diversity and fostering diversity is a good idea, and that diversity is something that will benefit, more diversity will benefit the institution. How do you find this common ground?
Well, I think there are part of that is cultural, but I'd like to believe that most people think that a giving everyone, no matter what their background is, opportunity to enter a university and succeed is something that we would all, I think, agree upon. But I do think that there's one very concrete example. Both Kieran and Denise mentioned data. And data can be very helpful in making a case to the public and to politicians about where deficiencies are. And as you know, and perhaps we'll hear more about that, data collection in Germany for historical reasons is very, very difficult. When one has to explain to people from outside, one cannot collect data on people's race, on their ethnicity, on their backgrounds. So much of this has to be inferred, and it's not a good basis for collecting data to make a case for policy that there needs to be change. What might appear to be a diverse environment may not actually be so at all when one looks at the data. And if I can just give one example, in German universities, oftentimes people who have migrant backgrounds are German citizens. Therefore, they're not counted in any kind of numbers, not even regulated data. They're seen as, and as someone told me, they are invisible because they have German passports, but that doesn't change their experience as a person with migration background. And I think those kind of differentiations need to be made more here to accomplish some of the strides that are made in Canada and the UK and the United States.
Thank you, Jeff. So let's move over to Göttingen and to our German voice in this panel. Professor Dr. Andrea Dorothea Bührmann, Vice President of the University of Göttingen since 2015, sociologist, and you have been Director of the Göttingen Diversity Research Institute for 7 years now. Maybe let's just pick up the point of the data protection. This is something that at German universities you work quite a lot. How much do you know about your students, Andrea?
Not so much. Thanks for invitation and being part of this interesting discussion. But I have to admit we don't know so much about our students, and this is all. I think one thing is that we have these laws against for data protection, and some people use these laws to hinder people to have or to get more data. This is the one thing, and the other thing is it's expensive to collect data. And I think that in Germany, not so many universities are very committed to diversity politics. The main driver was Excellence Initiative, I think, and of course the German, the DFG and the DRAD. But I hope we are on a good way.
Mm-hmm. But as of now, you think you would agree that German institutions are lagging behind when it comes to diversity strategies as opposed to some of the countries that are represented today?
Of course. We have to learn a lot because I think the main challenge is that that the universities in Germany are not used to the worldwide competition to all other universities. And this is new for us. And the other thing is we have this big old tradition. We are very traditional, as you all know, Göttingen is a very traditional university, and we think we know everything and we don't have to change anything. And I think this is one of the things. And the other thing is that in Germany, people didn't see that we have and had a very diverse population. And this is we are not an immigration country. And we have some battles about big religions and so on. And it's important. For many people in Germany, it's important to have this pure German people.
So they had the illusion, they were under the illusion that we are not an immigration country, even though we have been an immigration country for many years, but they tried to keep up an illusion that was, well, maybe true in the 50s or something like that, probably not even then. You have been a vice president of your university for 5 years, I think, since 2015. So could you give us some examples of the battles that you are fighting for more diversity?
I wouldn't say that they are battles, but I have to make clear that diversity is very important. And I developed 3 narratives for different groups. The one for the managers is the business case. It's all to not to expend too much money. The other one is for the equity case, to make clear for almost the students that everyone should study at Göttingen. And I like the excellent case. I call it the excellent case. The most is to make clear, if we want to have more innovation, then we have to have more diverse researchers and students. Mm-hmm. And then we will get more innovations. And I think this is the best narrative, I think. And our distinguished researchers like this narrative. And the other thing is, you have to see, we have a lot of very well-known researchers, and of course, they think they don't have to change anything because it's all good for them. And in Göttingen, we have a lot of students, a lot of traditional students, and they feel not very good if they are no longer privileged, but treated the same like the others. And some people think this is they are discriminated against, and I think they are not discriminated against, but they are no longer privileged, and this is a big difference. Yes, and I think you have this in Canada and the US. It's a white the white old men who have this
yeah.
feeling.
Thank you very much. And this is one question that I would like to pass on to the rest of the panel. It's wonderful that in Canada, in Britain, in the US, you have all those strategies and institutional ambitions, but isn't there the same debate among students that those who felt that they were the majority so far, and they were the majority because they had all the power, are afraid of losing grounds now? And what does that do to the debate inside in the university? If there are people who fear that more diversity will make them lose out. I think this is a debate that is not only a German one, is it, Kieran?
I think certainly not in the UK. Matters of social justice, as we think about generational thinking, are becoming increasingly important to the young people that we work with. So as we look at Generation Z, who will soon be Generation Alpha, who have grown up with the internet all of their life, who have more interest in the fate of our planet and the fate of social justice and equality and fairness, we are at risk of looking out of step if we are not wholly committed to matters of social justice. So when we work in schools and colleges, we see students being very invisible to ideas of difference. We see that traditional approach that many of our elder members of the professoriate or our senior colleagues might see is not real. Issues of colour are accepted from an earlier age, and the education system is better at dealing with it than universities possibly are. So I think we are high risk if we as universities aren't very open to the fact that matters of diversity are in the UK are now deciding factors for students as to whether they will choose a university or not. Mm-hmm. Is this university committed to social justice? Is it committed to fairness and equity? Is it committed to issues like trans rights, the rights relating to people of colour? These are issues that are divisive in probably a positive way, I would say, in the UK.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Denise, how about the debate in Canada when it comes to the fears of white people, of advantaged white people who fear that they might lose some of their traditional benefits?
Yeah, thank you, Jean-Martin. This is a really good question, and it speaks to really what has been there all along, a differential balance of power and who has access to universities and who do not. Universities are public institutions. In Canada, they're the public good. And because they are such, there are very high expectations. And so when we think about our students who come from various different generations and who expect more in the area of social justice, that is something we are not used to in terms of universities. And we go towards the language of inclusion and inclusive excellence, which sounds much nicer. But if we're really serious, and this is part of the debate in Canada, if we're really serious about inclusion, that means we have to look at disrupting the status quo. The status quo has been predominantly white male professors, predominantly white students. And if we are truly aiming towards inclusive excellence, there is a lot of talent out there at the ranks of students, of faculty, of staff that have been invisible and overlooked, however way you wish to define it. And so understanding that addressing it will add value to everyone and add value to the organization and society is an important strategy to take.
But does the majority of white male professors understand that?
I would say, I would not say the majority, but I would say increasingly more white male professors see the value to it. And they also have students who come from different marginalized groups and recognize their challenges and their struggles in being in university environments. Mm-hmm. And I would just add from a survey that was done in the US under the Harry Institute, the Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA, increasingly more and more professors are recognizing that it is their role to help their students recognize diversity and learn how to operate within a diverse democracy.
Jeff, how's the situation at CUNY? I know that it's a very diverse university, a very diverse place, but still there are a lot of white Anglo-Saxon professors also at American universities that are not everybody of those are just excited about the idea of diversity, I can imagine.
I think that's true, but I would have to agree with Denise. And I think this is also with what Kieran said, this is also, I think what distinguishes, when I was trying to emphasize before, the difference between German and North American and British universities, there's a different relationship between, I think, the university and the students, and also between the faculty and the students. But to your point, I think this is why equity is so important, because it's important to recognize that access, and that at CUNY, for example, this was a major concern, and there were many, many programs to try to identify and bring students from minority backgrounds, and most of the students, or a large number of students at CUNY, are of minority backgrounds. And so at a place like CUNY, you would find few, I think, white professors who wouldn't go along with this. But that's not atypical, since CUNY is the most diverse, one of the most diverse universities in the United States. But I think that increasingly faculty at American universities are recognizing that there is a problem in terms of equity, that everything has to be done at the university, and that faculty have to be involved in remedying some of this situation by their advising with the kind of advice they give to students, students that they may interview, opening up other pipelines for students to apply. I think, again, this is one of the differences, is that there's a whole not only a structural system in place in these other universities, but an attitude that this is something that must be done. This is something that we have to do to not just to be competitive, but it's also the right thing to do to give every human being an opportunity. Some people are disadvantaged. In the German case, we do see some examples of this. For example, the recognition that students who don't come from families where the parents have gone to the university are disadvantaged. And there are programs that try to identify and support. I think there's one called Arbeiterkind, children of working class people, to try to get students into the university to support them. But I think that there's still a lot more work that needs to be done here, even when we hear the work that needs to be done in the UK and the United States and Canada. There's still more systemic issues that have to be addressed here.
Thank you very much. Andrea, there's one comment in the chat that says, I appreciate the honesty of the lady from Göttingen University. Diversity of mindset needs to be improved in German universities. So you're applauded for your honesty, but well, that is very nice that you are honest, but the situation is dire at German universities when it comes to diversity in many cases. You said earlier that the excellence argument works very well when you try to persuade or to convince, I imagine also white male professors that diversity is a good idea. But I sometimes wonder, is there any hard evidence that diversity fosters excellence? I think I would agree with it emotionally, but is there any hard evidence for that? Sound, yeah, you have to turn on the sound, please.
Thanks for this very tricky question. I think I have to admit, there is I know no study that says that diversity is better than a homogeneous team. And this is very easy because if you have a look to diverse teams, then you can't have a look at not diverse teams. So this is a big question, I think. But I think if you have a look at the Nobel Prize laureates or the excellence clusters, we call this in Germany, when you see not only a white old man with a bourgeois background, but there's a big team around him, usually him, and the man, mostly the men who got the Nobel Prize, they are working in teams. And everyone knows that working in a diverse team is better than working in a team, in a homogeneous team where everyone knows what everyone would say. And for instance, we are in this diverse discussion panel. We are also diverse. And why? Because we try to learn more about diversity and to make this change management. And because of this, the British Council, the DRD, the Fulbright people say, oh, we at least we should have men and women. I think this is very interesting. And we should have people from different international backgrounds. And we have people from different age. I think this is also very interesting. So
thank you so much. Thanks. Jeff, you said earlier, it's the right thing to do and it also fosters excellence. You know, it makes the institution better, but it's also the right thing to do. Let's leave the right thing to do aside for a minute, you know, and let's talk about how it makes an institution better. And the same question to you that I just asked Andrea, how can you find evidence that this is true and not just gut feeling?
Thank you. No, I think there's a lot of evidence. Just one example is if you look at the Harvard Business Review, since we're talking about competition and competitive edge, to bring in a kind of business and capitalist motif. There are many, many studies that one sees there, but there are also other studies that are done by people in higher education and across the board. You see many of the institutions, scientific associations, scholarly associations who are writing diversity statements. There are studies that have been done by those organizations to show that excellence is there's an advantage to having diversity to build excellence. And what it is it's not rocket science. I mean, if you bring more people to bear from have different mindsets and different backgrounds, people have opposing viewpoints that they then have to compete against each other. One becomes more self-critical. One questions other people's opinions as well as their own. It opens up perspectives for everyone involved. It creates collegiality. It creates a collaborative atmosphere. And also people feel that they belong more when they're in those kind of situations. All of those criteria create a more excellent environment, or an environment that will create more excellent research, teaching, and collaboration of all kinds.
Mm-hmm. Denise?
Yes, just to pick up on that, in the higher education research, several studies done by Mitch Chang and colleagues have looked at universities and their level of diversity within those organizations, and have shown that with a greater level of diversity, there is increased levels of critical thinking that is happening, increased levels of perspective taking, understanding other people and how to operate in their own shoes, and from different perspectives, and also greater levels of collaboration and so forth, and dialogue. Even though people may come together, they have to be able to speak to their own experiences, worldviews, and so forth. And with the way that universities have done so many years in the past, it's really about replicating themselves. And there are studies that show that faculty tend to bring in and hire more faculty who duplicate what's already there. But when we look towards breaking down that mold and bringing in greater talent, looking at talent that isn't there, naturally, it brings about greater excellence. It brings about more diversity and the ability to bring in more grants. There are various granting agencies that are requiring more diversity among research teams, as well as that being integrated into the research. And as Andrea mentioned earlier, the idea of those Nobel laureates, they had very diverse research teams, which included women, and often women have been excluded from receiving these kinds of awards. So it's about taking a hard and fast look at the way we've operated in the past and called that tradition and called that excellence, when actually it was a way of privileging particular groups over others. And now, if we're really serious about inclusion, it's about breaking down those barriers, breaking down those systemic ways in which we privilege particular groups over others, and then let everyone compete on a more or less equal playing field. But that takes work and intention.
Kieran, if you look at the data that you're collecting, can you see there that the faculty, that the faculty consists of are changing already? Is the demographics of the faculty at your university a different one from 5 years ago, 6 or 10 years ago? So do the measures actually work there in terms of more diversity? You have to turn on the sound.
A superb question, and if I think about the answers that our colleagues have made so far, Denise, Andrea and Jeff. I think I recognise many of the things that I've just heard already, but I think when I look at whether we've changed, we have changed, we're not changing quickly enough. I think if we think about the purpose of the university to generate knowledge, to stimulate discovery, to change the world through research, one of the ways you change the world through research is you understand the world that you live in, and that requires many voices to come to the table. And one of the key tools we're trying to use to make that happen quicker, or at least a little more quickly, is to think about our mentoring responsibilities. And that might be mentoring the research workforce of the future. So looking at early career researchers and making sure that we're interrogating, have we got a diverse range of people being mentored? Have we got mentors who are able, we had a great conversation the other day. It is possible for a man to mentor a woman very positively. They just have to want to do it properly. And so we've been having those difficult conversations. And we've also used our students to do interesting things. So one of the things we've done recently, we've had something called a reverse mentoring scheme, where we've taken some of our students, we've paired them with our senior academic colleagues in our medical school. And what we've discovered is that that's leading to better outputs in terms of research and better outputs in terms of education, because the people who are now leading the medical school understand the sectors and communities that they're serving better. They understand the voice of people from marginalized communities, the LGBTQ community. It's incredibly powerful for those people who will have very limited experience of engaging with a trans person to understand some of the complexity of existing within a healthcare setting if you are trans. And so that's a way that we can use our student population to inform our faculty too, and that changes the mindset, and hopefully it will accelerate. I think the reality is, regardless of whether you're in Germany, the US or Canada, the academy will change, but it will change slowly. The hope is that you can put in place structures and opportunities to influence that change positively, rather than rules and regulations.
Well, let's see how this works without rules and regulations. Andrea, in the German context, you talked about the excellence clusters that are really in many cases quite diverse on the one hand. On the other hand, if you look at the spokespersons of the excellence clusters, the majority is still male and older and without immigration background. And since we have the problem that the data oftentimes are not that good, we have to go back to what we know. And what we know is, for example, that the percentage of international professors at German universities have been low for many years and has stayed low. It's 7% now, new data coming out tomorrow, 7%. It has been 7, 6, 5, 6, 7% the last 10, 15 years. And 1/3 of them are from Austria. So obviously, when it comes to leading positions in the research community, there is no diversity at all yet at German universities, Andrea, from what we know, because we don't know that much.
Yes, but I think this is a very important point you're speaking of. It's about the recruitment processes, and we have this in older traditional universities. There are a lot of people from a bourgeois background. They are male, they are white, they are elderly, and they are looking for the sameness. They are not looking for women, not for people with a migration background. They are not looking for people with a non-traditional background, and so because I think I'm doing my job very well, and then the person who should become my colleague should be as similar as possible. And I think we have to think about this recruitment processes. And I think the best could be to have something like an assessment center, because becoming a professor It's not only important to write the right articles in the right journals, but it's also about teaching, and it's also about managing diversity and to try to find out or identify big questions. It's more than only writing the right articles. And in Germany, we are very concentrated on the it's called the Hirsch Index, the peer-reviewed journals, especially in English. This is very important in our recruitment strategies, and I think we have to modify this.
The funny thing is, even though we are so much interested in English language publications, the research output of German universities, if you believe in rankings, doesn't put them at the top, So obviously, even though they are so much interested in that, it doesn't really work out that well, Jeff.
Well, I didn't want to say that, but it's a good point. But I do think one has to acknowledge that historically, German universities have not given teaching and what we call in the United States the student experience much attention. And if one focuses primarily on research, which of course is very important, it's important in all university systems, to the exclusion of teaching and experience of students, one doesn't really confront the diversity issue because it's just not, it's not there. That's why I think, and the word has been used many times, intentionality is so important. There have to be rules and regulations. And on the other hand, people have to be recognized and rewarded in institutions for doing what these rules and regulations say they should be doing around diversity. If we let people to themselves, they're not going to do anything. It's too much work. It's not comfortable. So it does mean that institutions, and I think the UK is such a good example of this, has set up systems, structures, rules in place that give advantage to people and institutions that do this and disadvantage those institutions that don't. It's like with the tenure process. You have to recognize things in the process to make people see that it's also worthwhile for them to do. And if one just talks about diversity and no one sees anything, any disadvantage not to doing it, then they won't do it. So I think that rules and regulations, structures are very, very important, and that does need to be, when people follow those and contribute to the betterment of the institution, they should be rewarded in some way or recognized.
Denise?
Yeah, I agree with that. And part of the challenge in this whole journey when it comes to inclusion is the accountability aspect of it, and making sure people are held to a particular standard. And when I say people, I really mean our leaders, our chairs, our deans, however way the leadership structure or management structure is set up. They not only are to be held to account, but they also need the proper education and training and understanding as to how this works. So oftentimes people are tapped on the shoulder to be a chair, a leader in different ways without any recognition that they have any competencies in the area of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And that has to be a part of the required competencies, not a nice to have, but required as a part of it. Otherwise, it just won't happen. And even with that assumption being made, some people are really good at being inclusive when it comes to women, but they are not when it comes to other marginalized groups. We don't have the same level of competency when it comes to all these different areas. But if there is a willingness to learn and be intentional, as Jeff said, and as Karen mentioned, within the UK, there's the Athena Swan. In Canada, we adopted the Athena Swan, and we call it Dimensions, to speak to the fact that there are intersectional experiences that people have. They're not just one thing. They're not just a woman. They're not just Indigenous. They're not just queer, but that there are intersectional experiences that they have in the research environment ecosystem impacts them because of those various identities. And so aspects of microaggressions that happen, different conflicts that emerge, they can't be overlooked. They have to be addressed in order for us to really take advantage of the great talent that's there.
Thank you very much. At this time, I would like to thank Britta Piel from Freie Universität, who is watching or observing the chat and is providing us here in the panel with some of the questions and some of the comments. And I would like to read one or two to you. And a summary of comments on diversity in the chat. There are a lot of comments on that. And Britta writes, there are several studies done on teams and evidence that diverse teams lead to more success. But diverse teams are only excellent when bias stereotyping are reduced by leadership and building on an inclusive culture. It needs intentional transformation from top to bottom, including all stakeholders. And then there's a question later on. So very specific, what are really actions taken in order to promote diversity? What programs and actions are in pipeline? What can we expect? So the audience really wants to know more about specific problems, actions that are being taken. So not so much nice talk that we are doing, but more about some of the measures that are being taken. And maybe Kieran, you could start with that. There has also been a question to you, Kieran, were concerns raised when the standardized collection of equality data was introduced in the UK regarding privacy? How were the concerns responded to? Maybe you can answer that question, and also then give us some more examples of concrete measures and action towards more diversity.
Yes, no problem at all. I can do that. The data question is actually very simple, which is that there weren't concerns raised. Part of the reason being that lots of the information is kind of gathered as part of our annual census process through our Office for National Statistics. So, for example, information about demography, information about household income or propensity to enter higher education is comprised and provided to the sector. So we're given that on a national basis, and those national data sets are helpful. But secondly, the Information Commissioner's Office has built really good data protection regulation. Everyone in the UK, broadly speaking, is aware of what that would be. And because there is a reasonable reason for collecting that data, people weren't bothered about providing it. Everyone's given the opportunity to exclude themselves if they wish, but the exclusion rate of data is relatively low, with very small percentages of people who don't answer that question. And often when we work with our staff community who say, but I'm very nervous around asking someone about their disability, I remind them that people with a disability are used to talking about that disability normally. They live with it, it's part of their life, and they realize that if there's a reasonable reason for providing that information, they're prepared to give that to you. Give them the opportunity not to answer that question, and you are well within your legal duty. And that's how the data protection element happened. In terms of some specific actions, I think both Jeff and Denise have talked in the last answer about some of the actions that are taken that are hard in the UK sector. So a good example within the academy, research grant funding is now allocated in some cases on the basis of your ability to evidence that you are taking equality seriously. And that might be through the Athena Swan process, which looks hard at aspects relating to gender equality. It may be through our emerging race equality charter submissions, but we are expected and encouraged in many ways to look at holding a mirror up to ourselves, so writing strong self-evaluation documentation. I am our institutional lead for our race equality charter submission. I'm holding a mirror up to the university. I'm asking us how we perform, and then we're expected to produce action plans to show how we will improve our performance over a 3 to 5 year period. So that might be policies around, for example, childcare. So we know that if you're wanting to develop a fair approach to being part of an excellent research team, having fair policies relating to childcare and leave are critical. We know that, for example, if we want to deal with and tackle with issues of harassment and bullying relating to either race or gender or sexuality, a clear confidential and consistent reporting process is important. So those are the kind of things that we're doing as hard actions, and it's leading to positive outcome because we're having to commit to it to derive funding or to derive access to some of our strands of activity.
Thank you very much. I would like to collect some more examples of hard action that is being taken. Denise.
So another action that's being taken is that a number of our different departments and faculties have created their own equity, diversity, and inclusion committees so that they can bring to bear at a local level the values of EDI and begin to incorporate it into the curriculum, into the admissions of diversity of students, into who they bring in terms of hiring and promotion. So it really requires a comprehensive, systematic approach. So that's more or less a broad way of looking at it, from local departments creating their own committees. And then specifically, I sit on our academic standards committee, and one of the requirements within the rubric of looking at program reviews is to include a diversity criteria, and that is looking at the diversity of students, the diversity that is incorporated into their curriculum, the diversity of their faculty, and that provides an opportunity for us to begin to embed these values directly into the organization. And lastly, I'll say is that a number of universities, given that I'm speaking about the Canadian experience in higher education, everyone is very aware that our Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit population has been marginalized in so many different ways through colonialism and so forth, that there are direct programs that have been developed to provide access for Indigenous students, various pathways into programs by identifying slots for Indigenous students, also recognition of Indigenous elders, and that their worldviews being on par with the Western NICE worldview that is brought into the academy. And so there are many different things that can be done, but again, it's about intentionality.
Thank you so much. So let's keep talking about some of the measures. And Jeff, I would like to add one more question. Have the panelists got concrete examples of measures and instruments that genuinely address intersectionality? Maybe you can also address that question while answering the measurement or action question, Jeff.
Let me address the intersectionality part first, or maybe that's the part I really would prefer to answer. I'm glad the word intersectionality was brought in because although it's to some people's ears sounds extremely theoretical, which I guess it is, it really comes down to what we've been talking about, which is that each human being has many different identities that at different times and different contexts are foregrounded or not. And that's why I think this issue of context is very important, because experiences of Americans, for example, who go to a country, we had this example in the Fulbright Commission of teaching assistants, African Americans who would go to Eastern Europe where they'd never seen an African American person before, raises very particular issues about intersectionality that have to do with gender as well as race, potentially also religion. And yet there are diverse populations within some of these countries in Eastern Europe, which are not also not being attended to. So I think intersectionality is a term that, along with diversity, has to always be kept in our minds. It's not only about one identity, it's about many identities and how they interact with each other in different times and different contexts. Your other question was about measurement.
the action question. You know, what concrete actions are being taken?
Okay.
I mean, there's a lot of talk out there at the universities, as we know, and we have talked a lot about the necessity and the goodness of being a more diverse environment, but what concrete actions are being taken?
Well, this goes back to what was stated before about rules, regulations, or we could even talk about guidelines, because in the question I see there was the issue of guidelines and leadership. Let's put aside the response about it's the right thing to do. What we're talking about in terms of changing institutions for the benefit of individuals who have been disadvantaged and improving the institution at the same time will not work unless there are guidelines in place, unless there are leaders in place who do not only talk about this, but show in every way in terms of the policies they promote and the challenges that they offer their faculty and students, that this is a top priority. And the example in the question was about in a research team and so on. Again, most individuals or many individuals will not do anything about this unless they see that they're being accountable, to go back to Denise's point. Accountability is central in making these changes because it takes time, it takes work, and as I said before, it's uncomfortable. So it depends on the institution, but it should be clear from the leadership to the vice presidents or deans and to chairs or heads of research teams that this is part of what their activities are and not some sort of extra or icing on the cake. I can only repeat that because, again, when we heard from our colleague from Göttingen, we have, in Germany, there are diversity strategies being written, there are vice presidents for diversity, but I haven't yet seen in so many universities, but I think that it's now developing, these kinds of guidelines or accountability standards that will make people move in the direction that we're discussing.
So Andrea, are they there, those guidelines and accountability standards? In addition to that, there's a question, how is the diversity of the student body evaluated? Is data available, measured in German universities? So this is maybe part one. How do you know? What data do you have? And part two, what guidelines, what types of accountability are there?
We have the so-called social survey from 2016. This is the latest survey, and there we have some information about the background of our students in Germany and for each university. It's called the Randauszählung, marginalized counting. This is the one thing, but of course we don't know so much about disabled people, about transgender people, about, as mentioned before, people with migration background. For instance, my name, Bührmann, is not a German last name, but a Dutch one, or nobody knows. I am not a migrant, but my grandfather was a migrant. This is the one thing. The other thing is in Göttingen, we try to become a system accreditation university. And in this systems accreditation, we have three criteria for good curricula, and this is internationalization, this is diversity orientation, and this is digitization. And in each group, we have to discuss whether this criteria is there or not. And so we have a lot of little groups in our university who are discussing how it could work. And our so-called top team is the latest discussion round, and I am responsible to have a look at these different criteria. So I think we have, in a way, we have some measures to to do to improve our diversity or our diversity orientation. And the other thing is, of course, we have this kind of anti-bias trainings, and we have workshops and so on. But I think this is usual, even in Germany.
And the question is always, do they really make a difference, those workshops, if people may go voluntarily or not, whatever, but does it really change anything? And how do we measure that?
But the curricula, it's not about figures, it's about the curricula. I think this is very important.
There's one comment that I just want to read to you. You were talking about the excellence clusters earlier. There's this comment: recruitment process is one thing, but what do we put people through if they get to the excellence clusters? Gather some discrimination experience? No, thank you. So basically, some people make it, some people get there, but first they have to experience a lot of discrimination to get there, Andrea?
I'm afraid, yes, I think so. But I think all universities in Germany try to reduce this discrimination against people from marginalized and discriminated groups. But we have to learn a lot, and I think this is we can learn a lot from the US, from UK, from Canada, because you made it before us, and I think this is very important for me. For instance, to when I talk to my president, when I can say, oh, the University of Berkeley, they have a very diverse student body, but they are one of the best university in the world. And do we want to become this?
One more question to you. Sorry, one more question to you, Andrea. Could you tell a little bit more about the concept of assessment professor that was brought up in the question? The question is, as the commentator understood it, that you have brought up.
Yes, what I want to express is that normally we are looking for the heroic genius professor who does his research alone in the evening or so. But nowadays we have to look for team players, and to invent things. And I think, for instance, I'm a professor. I'm involved in recruitment processes, but I'm not a professional recruiter. And I think it could be worthwhile to learn more about professional recruiters. Because I think it's also something, it has to do with the character of recruited people. They have to play together, not alone.
Thank you very much. If we stay with recruitment, there you talked about workshops, anti-bias workshops, and they were also mentioned in the question here that some German universities, few German universities offer those workshops for recruiting or before recruiting professors for their staff. And I would like to pass this question on to the rest of the panel. What do you think about those workshops, anti-bias workshops for faculty? Does that work? Does it make a difference? Is that something that it's worthwhile doing, or is it just something for, well, like to look good, to look better than you actually are as an institution? Denise.
Okay, so there's growing research out there that is showing diversity training, anti-bias training, and so forth is not that effective unless it's coupled with some form of accountability and sustainability. It cannot be a one-shot deal. The fact that you do the training and then you're all knowing about this. It just doesn't work like that. And even in my working with colleagues at Ryerson and other universities, what we found that is more effective is not just starting out with an anti-bias training at the beginning, but that the faculty, the committee coming together actually have a discussion about what their goals are related to diversity for that particular hire, and get it all out on the table so that we can determine what our priority is, and to designate someone on the committee as the diversity lead. Not the recruiter, but someone on the diversity lead who understands the different policies, can bring that to bear throughout the entire process. Because after the training is done, it just goes out the window if it's not sustained throughout the entire dialogue and process. And we're looking through our collective agreements to, as some other universities have already done, to make it a structural change so that all committees that are doing hiring have an equity representative or have some form of representation like that.
Would anybody from the panel like to add to that? Jeff?
Yeah, I agree very much with what Denise said. And I think the thing that's at the basis of what I think all of us are saying here is that to make this kind of diversity training work, and it's part of an entire cultural paradigm shift in the university system. And so in German university, when they listen to the kinds of things we're saying from our three countries, this is why it's important to recognize it takes time, it's a long process, and it requires a buy-in from everyone, not only in the institution, but from the politicians as well, especially in Germany. But you see, for example, how this has to do with questions of faculty, or the Lehrstuhl, the chair, the process of having Lehrstuhls in Germany of chairs, and that changing, and tenure track. All of these are cultural shifts in the German university system that will open it up to allow the kind of work that we're talking about to make it more possible. Otherwise, it becomes simply an add-on. It simply becomes doing what one thinks one's supposed to do. And so clearly it's going to take time, but there has to be, I think the recognition is important that this is a broader cultural shift and paradigm shift that touches every part of the university. So it's not just about diversity, it's about how departments are organized. It's about who the head of a department is, because as we said before, often people hire people who are like themselves. So the same thing, why aren't there more international professors here? Yes, even though there's a great strides in internationalization. So I think it's good to see this diversity issue in the context of a large cultural paradigm shift.
Which consists of many small little steps. And one of the steps that are being mentioned in the chat are interdisciplinary study programs. And the question is a shift from monodisciplinary study programs to interdisciplinary study programs also one of those little steps to foster diversity? Who would like to answer that question?
Perhaps I can do this, of course. And this is, in Germany, we do this already. And I think it's very important. I think there's a shift from disciplines to fields of research. And because of this, it's very important to do interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary studies. And I think this is very important in our so-called knowledge societies, and to deal with our big challenges of the world, not only in the universities.
And Jeff, isn't this the idea of liberal arts colleges anyway?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that the question of interdisciplinarity comes up again because I mean, I've been in this for a long time, and in the 80s, all we talked about was interdisciplinarity, but it's clear that it also represents a version of diversity, and it brings different points of view to bear. But again, if we think intersectionally, it's just one kind of diversity, and that it needs to be combined with many, many different kinds. And yes, of course, the liberal arts colleges in the United States are based, and not only liberal arts colleges, most general studies curricula in all college and universities are based on a liberal arts model. How interdisciplinary it is up to the institution. But I think that today interdisciplinarity is not enough. It's a step, but it's not the only way to go. It's certainly better than only focusing on individual disciplines.
Mm-hmm. So, Kieran?
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not going to be in the camp of interdisciplinarity, because interdisciplinarity often will just smash two forms of monoculture together if you're not careful. So if the world is surrounded by white male professors, you will find white male professors in both disciplines that you smash together. It's not going to change simply because you put two together. Now, I speak in defense. I am white and I am male, and we must remember that not all diversity is seen. There's lots of other non-seen elements of diversity, so it should not only be on seen. But I think if we are thinking carefully about interdisciplinarity, one of the biggest challenges in the UK movement, and it's student driven, is what they are calling decolonization and liberation of the curriculum. They want us to look hard at our curricula and answer the question, why, when we study philosophy, do we start with white, old philosophers? Why is it always the same? We hear a very monocultural voice, and that is the same even in liberal arts provision. So policy, politics, philosophy, economics, three sorts of smashed together to lead to brilliant outcomes. Not really, if you've not really thought about the diversity within your curricula, within your reading, within your research, and the voices that are part of that. And now we're finding that can be developed most effectively by working with our students, actually, because our academy isn't moving quickly enough in that space, and our students bring an interesting perspective. I have library representatives in my library who are responsible for proposing texts that could be included. Now, not all of our professors like that, but it is a reality, and it does help think about curriculum. So interdisciplinarity, I suppose it's the point about intersectionality that Jess just made. It's a useful lens by which to bring different points of view together, but you've got to have more underneath that different point of view than simply talking about interdisciplinarity.
All right, thanks so much. We have about 5 minutes left, and I'd like to thank the virtual audience for those many very interesting questions that really fostered our debate, our panel so far. And actually, there's one question that I would like to take as a final question to the whole panel for some final statements. And this is about dimensions of diversity in academia that might be easiest overlooked. Where do we need to be especially vigilant? And this is something that applies to all of our institutions and countries, not only to the German case, but to universities in Britain, in the US, and Canada as well. So what are the dimensions we have to be really careful so that we don't forget them and that we don't overlook them? And also, maybe, what can we do about that? So this is the final round of statement. And Kieran, since you just nodded, maybe you would like to start.
Kind of said a bit of it in my last answer. We've got to be very careful when we're thinking about diversity that we're not just looking at seen, because it's very, very easy to drag ourselves into seen rather than unseen. I think that one of the greatest risks and one of the places that we need to be most vigilant is in the space we've talked about a lot today, recruiting to the type that looks like, expecting it to feel the same as it always does, believing that the heroic professor, as we've heard described by Andrea, is the paradigm of quality within an organizational structure. And I think I talked about holding a mirror to ourselves, but being brave enough to say, if we put different voices in this room, something interesting might happen. I think is a really is where we must be vigilant and be brave. Be brave.
Thank you very much, Denise.
Yes, just to pick up on what Kieran said, this takes courage. This does take bravery, and it takes being vulnerable and recognizing that there are some things that we need to change. And speaking to the invisibility aspect of it, again, individuals with disabilities here in Canada, there is an emphasis on those that are seen and those that are invisible. And part of what we've tried to do in making that invisible aspect of it be more visible within the structure of addressing it is through our data collection. We actually consulted with members of our community who come from having various experiences around disabilities. And they very much wanted to be within the data collection process because they knew that we were doing it in a way that would protect their identity, but bring forward the collective message around what the institution needed to do to make that more visible, because they're often very hidden in the dialogue.
Thank you very much. Jeff Peck.
Well, since you mentioned the word vulnerable, I want to bring it back to we could call the human dimension of this. I think the bottom line for any of the work we've talked about is hard self-reflection and self-criticism, and being open to being questioned yourself, which means that we have to be vulnerable. And it does require courage, as was mentioned. And I think the area that, and I say this as a white American, is unconscious bias and privilege, which has been so much in the discussion in the United States, especially at these times. We have to learn how to do this better individually. We're not born, I mean, I do believe that in many ways we're born racist, we're born xenophobe, we're born we have to learn how not to be that way. And it takes a lot of courage to admit that, and a lot of work to change ourselves, because we don't naturally know how to do it. And unconscious bias is the space where this becomes the most evident, where we do things, microaggressions, other kinds of actions that we have no idea that are hurtful or deleterious to someone else. And I think this work we're talking about requires a lot of courage and a lot of work. And there has to be a commitment at all levels and in all sectors to make this successful.
Andrea, I put you last on purpose because I would also like you to say a few words on what you take from today's panel, maybe some lessons that you can learn and that you can take as the vice president of a major German university when it comes to working on diversity or fostering diversity. So first part, what do we tend to overlook? And second part, what will you take from today's conference for your work tomorrow, Andrea?
Tomorrow I'm on holiday. Yes, I think the most important thing is not to stereotype and to avoid something what Steele calls the stereotype threat. And this is about the stereotypes against white, elderly, bourgeois men and migrants and so on. I think the idea that they have a special character, I think this is wrong. I think this is very important. And the other thing I learned a lot this afternoon, because I learned a lot about the different perspectives on diversity. And I think this is very important, not to see only my perspective on this, but to see the other perspectives. And what Kieran said about the decolonization of our curricula, I think this is very interesting, because I am involved in a project called the internationalization of the curricula. But I think the decolonization, I think this is a step further. And the day after tomorrow, I will bring this in to the University of Göttingen. And the other thing is that we talked a lot about intersectionality, and I think this is also very important to make clear that I'm not only a woman, but I'm a white woman with a bourgeois, working class background and so on. To see the different roles and identities people could have. And third, I think it was very important to think about data, because I'm asked again and again, what's about the data? Do you think the measures work and so on? And data are very important in our discussions at university to make people think diversity is very important. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much from my side as well. So it's about leadership. It's about collecting and using data, as you said, which is a big, long way to go in the German context, I think. It's about what Jeff said, also real cultural change, which only comes in small little steps. And I think that that we talked about many of those little steps that can be taken. Not all of them probably could be applied by German universities because of a different cultural background, but I think that there's a lot of experience that we can learn from. And as there was a comment in the chat, many universities are willing to deal in better ways with diversity, even in Germany. And that is something that we also keep in mind. There's a lot of goodwill out there. And if there is a good strategy, if there is a good plan also by the university leadership, we can move ahead also in Germany. Thank you so much, Kieran Broadhead, Denise Green, Andrea Bührmann, and Jeff Peck. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, talking about diversity driving excellence, gaining the competitive edge. Thank you very much in the virtual audience, to everybody in the virtual audience for sharing your comments and your questions. Thank you to Britta Peel from Freie Universität to observing the chat and to providing us with some of the most interesting questions. And well, this is the end of the conference, and this is not the last IDE conference, I hope, but I hope it's the last IDE conference in this format. And I really hope that the next time we will meet for the IDE conference, this will be in person again and not virtually. I mean, better virtual than not at all. But I think we all agree that we hope for a better next year and for a next IDE conference in person. And just one more thing to ask everybody in the audience: if you have any idea, any suggestion for a topic for a future conference, let the organizers know. They are always willing to work on those with those ideas and to work out a new conference topic. So feel free to share your ideas. Thank you very much, everybody, again. Have a great evening and goodbye. Bye.